So I believe this is the 11th installment that I've made of a discussion that I'm titling Revisiting Displacements. And to some extent, this installment is somewhat misleading insofar as it belongs to that title, because I'm going to talk about work that I've done since the turn of the millennia that doesn't technically belong to the piece that I titled Displacements, that seemed to exist in a moment in the late 80s, but has kind of emerged, as a lot of my work does, in a series of processes of transformations across time in the decades that followed the initial presentation of that piece. So let me talk about what initially inspired this take on the idea of displacements. I had just early this morning watched a conversation between Al Filreis and some of his ModPo students reading and interpreting a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks called Boy Breaking Glass. And both the poem and the reading of that poem, the interpretations and the architecture of that piece, as well as the tectonics of the reading, reminded me a lot of work that I've done. And in both literal and figurative ways, I've done a lot of glass breaking. This image is not one of mine. This is an image that I found on the web, but it replaces an image that I have had at one time of a window frame that had broken glass that I used as a frame for not an art piece, but a kind of sculptural representation. And that piece, was embedded, as most of my work is, in a lot of different contexts. But I had it leaning against a wall in an apartment for quite some time, and then a move, made it impossible to take with, and as a lot of my art, again, I left it somewhere, so sort of abandoned art. So it has, a number of different connotations that my work raises a lot. This idea of window as classic idea of window as eye, camera looking through. In cinema, all of the beautiful imageries that occur through windows, particularly the plaintiff female subject looking through a window. My Germaine Dulac films, various images, this reflective glass surface, but also something that you look through, and then the webbing of the breaking of the glass and its relationship to Spider Woman, or the Weaver, which is also, if you're familiar with these mythological tropes, a figure of fate, but also of the artist and the craftsperson. So, the obvious bars on the window referring to prison, and perhaps if you're experienced with this, time spent in prison or in jail, and then all of the rest of the associations of this fragmentation of broken glass, and what it means to either look through or walk through a pane of glass, or to put one's hand, the tool that you use to make art, through a pane of glass, or to throw something as a different kind of artistic expression than, say, to throw a pot, or to throw paint, or but maybe not so far from the artistic expression of throwing a fit or a tantrum or throwing a rock at something else, right? Not just at a window, not just in relationship to the way that we see, but to the way that we're caged or barred or hampered by the figures of authority. So I had thought about a lot of these things, and I had thought about time spent in jail. I've never actually done any prison time, although I've known quite a few people who have. But it made me think of the times that I've spent in jail as art, and that seems counterintuitive in a certain way, but my experience of it hasn't been anything other than as a kind of expression, and I wanted to talk about that and to try to draw those experiences of time spent in jail, not necessarily around broken glass, but if broken glass comes in to it, that would be fine. But just more specifically about jail time as a kind of theatrical time or dramatic time, the way that in the Gwendolyn Brooks poem, breaking glass is an expression of craft in a certain sense. It could be taken as a theater, the act itself, or the work of the broken glass could be taken as the object. If you believe in art as object, the artifact of the artist. And so I wanted to explore that, and I'll begin with contexts of being arrested and how certain contexts of arrest are clearly artistic, and this plays into a lot of different things that I've been working with and considering in relationship to art as spectacle versus art as active participation, particularly in dramatic modes and performative modes. And then I think that I'll explore that further. And the rationale for doing it originally was because we are existing now in a time of political authoritarianism in which the police, attack citizens of the United States, and we become witnesses to these acts of violence, often without feeling that we have the ability to do anything about them. And there are psychological reasons for our inaction in the face of these events, or our passivity, or our acceptance. It has troubled me greatly that we're entering into a time of, or have entered into a time of a rise of neo-fascist authoritarian on the part of a lot of our citizens in the United States and across the world, and I found it disturbing, and I have looked for solutions of action where we feel incapacitated, and I've looked for them, in my own work and in others' work, and I have tried to engage these discussions in ways that I haven't neglected the difficulties that finding the courage and compassion to act in these terrible situations involves, but I've tried to offer suggestions on ways that we can get beyond whatever psychological impasses that we have in performing these kinds of difficult work, whether those impasses involve academic constructions of art as something that doesn't actually do work in the world, we think of that as like one more or less like innocuous, theoretical idea or whatever. But in times of grave crisis, we need the work to do something, right? So I've addressed those issues, and I've addressed psychological issues of like, I'm afraid, like, how do I get involved in a situation, trauma. I've addressed a lot of these issues, and that's basically what we're going to do today. So again, my mind is split, between this discussion that that I'm having with an imaginary reader or listener, and with the activities of my very real creature here beside me, demanding attention. So the first context of arrest that I want to talk about, occurred on the steps of the Supreme Court building and the street in front of the Supreme Court in Washington, D.C., and I was involved in a protest of the death penalty, and the arrest was very much planned as an action. So we were aware that we were going to be arrested. We were aware that we would get media coverage, and I was very much, aware that it was a performance. And so the question of what kind of a performance was it, and what did it, involve, was very interesting to me. So there were songs we were singing. There were movements that could have been regarded as a kind of dance, although in a certain sense it was very subtle. A movement, of taking a space, of occupying a space, in all the ways that one occupies a space, very differently than the way one sits in, say, a classroom, or that one sits in court. And when you sit in court, your body is controlled, right? So you don't have the opportunity to rise. You don't have the opportunity to speak. You're very much, you're performing, this role of prisoner, under the aegis of, what's considered polite and respectable, and that you cede to the dominion of this authority that has claimed you and claimed your right to occupy your own space. Not only for the time that you're there, but if you're convicted of a crime, then it can draw you back into that space anytime that it wants to. Take away your right to vote. It can take away your right to own certain kinds of property. It can take away your right to move. Like if you're a political refugee, your rights of citizenship and your rights of passage to move between places are extremely limited. Like, for example, Dennis Brutus, who was a political refugee from South Africa because of his activism against the apartheid government, and particularly directed toward investments in sporting events, including he organized boycotts of South Africa's participation in the Olympics and other things like this. But in general terms, he was a great organizer of protests and information campaigns, detailing both the horrors of apartheid, for people of color in South Africa, but also of ways of making one's work and activities participate in the challenge and change, that was demanded that time by the freedom movement, and in both in his participation with the African National Congress and other organizations that were struggling for the same freedoms. So performing an occupation of space is a kind of dance, but it needn't look like a dance. Its relationship to dance, is its grammar is somewhat simplified, but you draw attention to the fact that this space is being utilized in a way that defines it as a dramatic space, right? So noise, whatever sound that you make, and whatever movement that you make, whether it's walking or waving or forming a line, whatever that is. But you create a kind of stage, and it's a very old kind of stage. It's a liminal place that marks off space and time, creates its own you could say theater, or you could say sort of metaphysical performative circle, but whatever that creates this space, and then you draw attention to it, and depending on what kind of a space it is, if it's a political space like this, and you're in front of the Supreme Court building, you understand that you're not authorized to create this space, so you've already committed a crime by designating this space. So your theater itself is a crime. You already understand that. You haven't even broken any property yet, or whatever it might be that you're going to do. And we didn't, break any property. We were, functioning within we were actually functioning within the limits of the law, but we did expect to be arrested, because that's what happens. So we created this space and this dance, and there was a kind of music, right? And there was a kind of dance, and some people really actually did sing. There were some Buddhist monks, and there were some there was a group
from a local church, a local Christian church, and there were other people that actually performed chants and had little drums, little hand drums and things like this. So their musical performance and their dance was in some sense more conventional or less a metaphor than some of ours were. I tended, my work tends to be somewhat subtle, and almost perhaps too subtle. Sometimes people don't often get that it's art, like that it's always art. But I've chosen to make those kinds of confusions, and so I'm stuck with them when they disappoint me. But anyway, we created this space, and then we understood that is insofar as we weren't interfering with passages, right? The conventional use of space in that area, that we probably wouldn't be arrested. So knowing that we wanted to be arrested, to draw attention to the cause of, and did I mention what the cause was yet? It was a protest, against the death penalty, and specifically, drawing attention to the fact that the death penalty is used against people of color in the United States. These were, some of the issues, and I had been working with a group, Rebellion in Brooklyn, and our interests were specifically, sort of focused on, a lot of different areas, but one of the issues was political prisoners in the United States, such as Mumia Abu-Jamal, and attempting to draw attention to causes around issues of incarceration of people of color, and political dissidents, and we're very much aware of sort of the outcome of the event and its staging and different aspects of the way that it would become a performance while we were engaged in the action and following the action. I wasn't aware that my biggest role in the action wouldn't occur until we were actually in court. But I was aware of some of the other aspects of how these events might play out, and I didn't know Dennis at the time. I wasn't even familiar really with Dennis Brutus's work as a poet or as an activist. I had probably heard his name and associated him with freedom fighters in South Africa and different kinds of actions and protests of apartheid, but certainly at that point wasn't one of my teachers. So that's where we met, and Dennis actually was one of the individuals trained with my group of protesters in a holding space, and that space after the arrest became our second theater, and so that space was very much defined by authority, not by us. So it wasn't a taking of space, so we didn't mark it off. There was no like performative delineation of the space. So you had to create something different in that space to make it your theater, right? It was really their theater. It was the theater of the police, right? So they control your movement. For example, like there wasn't a restroom or anything like that where you could relieve yourself in the space that we were located. So anytime that you wanted to move or you had like a bodily function that you needed to relieve or whatever, you had to request, right? So at some point, while we were being held, I can't remember how long we were held for, but I had to use the restroom, so I had to like request. And then when you request that you're removed from the holding area to an area where you can perform these needed functions, right? You're escorted, by the police, and then at that point, your actions and that walk, to this place is, if you think of it as a theater, it's very much controlled, right? So they also want to take control of the dialogue in that theater, and then there might be ways of like asking you questions or engage. They're not really interrogations, but they're clearly not friendly, right? So they do weird things, right? Like I remember, okay, so these questions, being asked in this like sort of in a gruffy kind of way, and then I get to the place where I'm going to urinate, and then as I'm the police officer standing right there, and as I'm performing this function, he says to me, don't urinate on my shoes. And I was thinking, like, what a weird thing to say. Like, I had no intention of urinating on his shoes. So I don't know, maybe someone had done that before, but I had no intention. But it seemed like it's one of those things where people, and this happens a lot with the police, right? They say things to you that you're very shocked by. Like, do you even have the right, to say this to me? And it's a way of controlling, the dialogue and controlling the space. It's a kind of like way of, humiliating you and making you understand that you're under control, right? So it's a theater of control. It's a theater of authoritarianism. It's a theater of perverse sadism in a certain respect. Like there's like a certain aspect of humiliation in such a question. And that you could be treated as an animal, or And this happens like with people that are defined as having mental illness too, right? I spent a lot of time doing performative work around issues of mental illness, which I don't really particularly believe in, but I do believe in people that suffer from trauma and that end up institutionalized for various reasons. And it's the same idea. In There's very little really difference in the way that one is treated in an asylum in quotation marks and in a jail without quotation marks, because in both of those instances, there's like this concerted effort, to gain control over like all of your aspects of behavior, what you're allowed to say, how you're allowed to move, when you eat, your time, and not only your space is defined by an organized institution, but your time is organized by that institution, and almost all your bodily processes are organized. You're not allowed to shave when you want to, but maybe you're given a razor every third or fourth day, and then you have this quote unquote opportunity, but it's all really very much about control. Or you're placed in a situation where maybe there is a restroom or a place to relieve yourself, but it's exposed, so that again there's that humiliation. Or maybe there is a faucet that you could drink from, but there's not a cup. Or maybe they give you paper, but they don't give you a pencil, so you have to beg. Anyway, this is the kind of theater that it is. And then if you're politically active, or you're trying to define this space in your own terms, then you have to figure out a way to do it. So while we were there in this holding space, a lot of individuals had different talents, and they could either read a poem or sing a song, or perform in other ways, and create a very kind of like conventional, like almost like grammar school presentation of a theatrical performance. And it was interesting to me because the sophistication was certainly there so far as political strategies went, but then in creating this like theater of like self-organized consciousness, a lot of what went on wasn't politically engaged. Now Dennis is performed in a completely different way. I mean, his understanding of this space was very different, from some of the other, and a lot of the activists, that we were working with were young people, and it's it's understandable that it was really about biding time, their work. Dennis's clearly wasn't, and I've talked before, or maybe I haven't. I don't know. I've written about it before, but Dennis recited a poem, from memory about time, that he had spent in Robben Island. And this is, when Nelson Mandela was there, and they were there together. And, he's written a lot of poetry about it, and, talks about, the time they spent breaking rocks together. And, since, reading Dennis's work and, becoming part of it, breaking rocks with a hammer has been, a metaphor in my work, and embodied metaphor. Like, that is, I have a sledgehammer. It weighs 16 pounds. I use it, as part of my political theater. And, and very much, when I do, I remember Dennis, and it always comes back to this particular, well, not always, but it often comes back to this historical context of taking an activity or a confined and subjugated existence and transforming it into a political tool of action and activism. So that's what my hammer represents. So Dennis read a poem about the experience of being on Robben Island, and right away it was different from the other works that people perform, because maybe someone had sung a song about Vincent van Gogh, or someone had read a poem, and that they had written about where they lived or whatever, and but Dennis was clearly drawing an analogy between the space in which we were located and the space that he had been in years before. So implicitly he was drawing an analogy between our experience in this space and his experience in that space on Robben Island. And we understood this, and we also understood that the content of the poem would represent some dimension of what our experience in this space that we were occupying could be or might become. And so I already understood right away that he was telling us that we would find a song here, right? So we would find a prison song. So whether we found it in that moment in what he read or not, the experience that we had there would be a kind of prison song. And this related, like, for me, back to ideas of work songs that were performed by African Americans traditionally in custody, right? So like songs, these gospel styled spiritual songs that were used as labor songs to swing hammers or to perform other kinds of work, and also related to those moments earlier, before incarceration was the way of controlling African American subjectivity in the United States to the time of slavery, and the work songs performed on the plantations. So I was very much aware of being like part of like this history, and the poem was a metaphor for this. And I'm gonna take a break because my dog needs to go outside, or he thinks he does. He's seeing something out there, and and I don't want to keep him incarcerated. So I'll be back. All right. He'll probably start barking again, and I'll have to let him in. But for the time being, he's probably okay. So the content of the poem that I was regarding as this kind of song that Dennis recited while we were there in the space was about confinement on Robben Island, and about some of the ways that the political prisoners and other prisoners, their actions were delineated, their movements were defined in the same way, more with much more extreme consequences, and with much more extreme limitations than ours were, but by similar means, and their discourse, and their ability to communicate with one another, or sing, or converse, was also limited. And so his poem was about that limitation, but about transcending that limitation, and how this was done. So he talked about how even in this imposed silence in which no one was allowed to speak to another prisoner, often a voice, would begin to sing. And in the singing, he spoke of the song, using the metaphor of a flight of birds. And another voice, another bird, would come into the song, and soon there would be a chorus of all of these voices singing this freedom song. And these voices, like birds, would fly in a circle above the prisoners, above their individual cages, their cells, right? And they would circle, and the spirit of this song would circle higher and higher until finally, it reached the ceiling of their confinement. But it wasn't, enough, and wouldn't stop there, that these birds, somehow managed to pass through the walls of the prison and fly off into the sky above, like free souls, right? So that the spirit, could not be defined by this space. So it was a really interesting for me moment, in understanding and challenging my sense of what an artistic space was, because I realized that how limited my understanding of space was, and was, not only when I was being defined by an authoritarian space, but even when I was composing my own space, I was limited because I didn't allow my imagination, to utterly free itself from its self-imposed, constructs. And so this image, was super revelatory for me. And Dennis would have probably laughed at the way that I used it and metaphorized it, in certain ways as space-time travel or other ways of moving, betwixt and between. But I think he would have appreciated the way that I will always have tried to use it, in the service of the service of political and social, movements of freedom, and of challenging these, imposed spaces and bars and confinements. Both. What is it? Blake says, there's some expression about shackles of the mind, and first we become prisoners of the ideology, and then in transcending that prison, if we're lucky enough to do that, that some of us become prisoners of these other kinds of bars, and then if we're lucky enough to transcend our understanding of that prison, then we become prisoners of some other kind of bars. But finally, Dennis clearly was no longer confined, by those types of conceptualizations, and that was coming to a really powerful understanding for me, as well as the understanding that I came that art does do work. It really does do something. It plays like the performance of all of those different pieces in the prison. It plays, but it does real work too. Those birds really did fly out of the prison, and you can say that's a mere metaphor, but the soul frees itself first, and then you find a form to express it. So to me, the clarity of his understanding was its own demonstration of the work that he was committed to doing, and that he was able to pass on to us as a kind of assignment, as opposed to confinement, I suppose.